good morning or good afternoon to everyone, depending on where you're joining us from around the globe. I want to start first by thanking everyone for taking the time to register for this webinar and in fact for joining today. Before we officially get started, I just want to mention that this webinar is intended for biopharma professionals. And today we hope that you'll be able to take away really some insights that, if applied within your own organization, might actually result in potentially a more streamlined approach to expanded access. So to kick things off, I want to begin with just some brief introductions. I'll start with myself. My name is Stephanie Firket, and I am the Director of Expanded Access Strategy and Customer Success at My Tomorrows. I've been working in the area of expanded access now for about 8 years, and most of that time spent within the biopharma industry. But prior to that, I managed global clinical trials within both academia and in biopharma. Just prior to joining My Tomorrows, I was at Alexion Pharmaceuticals, where I had the great pleasure of actually working with our panelists today, Neve Murphy, who is the Senior Director of Managed Access within Global Medical Affairs at Alexion. So thank you so much, Neve, for joining us today. Having worked so closely with you for that wonderful period of time in my career, I know really firsthand the level of expertise that you bring to this space personally. And truly, I think you sharing your experience is going to be really useful for our audience today. So thank you again. And perhaps you can just take a moment here to provide kind of a brief background of your experience, both at Alexion, but also leading up to your current role.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Steph. And honestly, the pleasure was all mine getting to work with you, and delighted to join you here today. So yeah, like expanded access has kind of really been a golden thread that's run through my medical affairs career. I've been working in medical affairs for nearly 10 years now. My first exposure was when I was an MSL, and like many of us who've done that role, had the experience, had a physician come to me requesting compassionate use for one of our pipeline products for his patient. At the time, the company I was working in, we didn't actually have an expanded access framework. So obviously I sent the request off to the Global Medical Affairs team, and they declined it. And really it was because of a lack of process. It wasn't for not wanting to provide access to patients. We just didn't have the framework to do that in. A few years later at that same company, they did implement a huge piece of work to implement a managed access framework, and started initiating kind of these pre-launch global managed access or expanded access programs. And at the time in that company, I actually moved to become a global medical affairs director, and was actually responsible for designing and leading one of those global expanded access programs. After that, I moved to a small rare diseases company, which again, they had no expanded access framework at the time. And when I started there, we actually had a treatment that was in submission with the FDA and the EMA for a life-saving product for a genetic disease that was actually fatal in newborn babies. And so, as you can imagine, we were like flooded with requests at the time, and that was really the trigger to set up an expanded access framework so we could provide access for those patients in kind of an equitable and sustainable manner. Because of my experience in my previous company, obviously I was involved in that core team for developing that framework, but really we were flying the plane while we were trying to build it there. So, you know, instead of forward thinking and having expanded access, we were triggered into developing one just because of this product that we had and the need. And then lastly, obviously, as you mentioned, my current role, I'm now at Alexion, which is the rare diseases unit at AstraZeneca, and I'm responsible for expanded access programs across our unit here. We term them at Alexion managed access programs. So I do apologize if I flip between terminology during this talk.
Yeah, no, thank you so much, Neve. And you use the term kind of flying the plane while you're building it. And I think that's far too often the case and the reality for many people working in this space. And so hopefully today we can provide some insights into how to tackle this so that your organization can be ready for those first requests.
Absolutely.
So to kick things off, I think a quote that really resonates with me, and perhaps is a quote that inspired the topic for this webinar today. And I think we can all agree that expanded access is not the most straightforward space to be working in. I think, or I'm sure that many people on this call have at one point felt a little bit like you're swimming against the tide within your organization, um, perhaps with little direction, potentially a lack of support, maybe even limited internal expertise to really effectively drive expanded access initiatives forward. I myself have certainly been there once or twice before. And it's always been through knowing that on the other side of any challenge or barrier that I might be facing, there is a patient who might be desperately waiting for a treatment that might change the course of their disease or might even save their life. And it's in knowing that I persevere in the face of any challenges I might be facing. So today we want to share ideas and best practices to help all of you on the call also persevere in the face of similar types of challenges. I think that certainly with the right innovative approach, many of those challenges actually can be alleviated. So from today, we hope that you're going to be able to take away that with the right framework, your company can be prepared even before you receive that first request, as Neve mentioned in her introduction. We want you to gain an understanding of the value of developing such an internal framework, one that really drives cross-functional collaboration, to plan for expanded access both early but also strategically. We also want to give you ideas about establishing decision makers and defining a clear governance process that works within your own organizations. And we also want to introduce aspects of infrastructure that can help ensure that your expanded access operations are both effective, efficient, and also scalable. So let's just jump right in. Throughout the presentation, we're going to be discussing elements of such an internal framework that we've been referring to, an internal framework for expanded access, which is really just you can think about it as a unified and a structured approach to enabling the delivery of consistent, compliant, and really patient-focused expanded access solutions globally. So I want you to imagine that this framework, this internal framework, is a puzzle. And that puzzle is made up of four big pieces. Unfortunately, each of those pieces is its own puzzle in and of itself, which adds some complexity. What we're going to do today is break down the four major puzzle pieces, which are defined structure and terminology, early and strategic planning, cross-functional collaboration, and governance, and finally, infrastructure and resources. So we'll begin with structure and terminology, starting with the absolute basics, terminology. And even though it might sound maybe a little bit silly, it does actually create a lot of complexity and can cause great confusion within an organization. Different people, different companies, different regulators, they all talk about expanded access very differently. And to level set with everyone here, when I'm using the term expanded access today, I am using this as just an umbrella term to refer to the provision of access to a medicine not yet approved or available in a country outside of a clinical trial. And Neve mentioned earlier that at Alexion, they use the term managed access. So already we talk about things a little bit differently, but we're talking about the same thing, expanded access or managed access, or any one of the other names that you see pop up on your screen in front of you. So expanded access is really the term that My Tomorrows uses, both internally and externally, when we discuss the topic, to make sure that our audience is always aligned on what we're talking about. So number one, I strongly suggest that you align on how your organization talks about expanded access. establishing that specific internal terminology can really facilitate alignment within your organization. It helps to avoid confusion and it improves consistency in terms of internal training, communications, and in so many other ways. And at the same time that you're establishing your internal terminology, it's also really important to address and account for the fact that the scope of expanded access may actually change along the development path. The graph shown here really depicts key milestones along that development path, and the green line is meant to represent the anticipated changes in request volume over that time. And here we're overlaying that graph with examples of how expanded access might actually be classified differently associated with each of those milestones. So for example, very early in development, perhaps following your phase 2 clinical trial results, maybe potentially earlier, you may begin receiving kind of your first ad hoc requests. Perhaps these requests are for patients who are not eligible or maybe are not able to access your ongoing clinical trials. And you might want to classify this category as single patient requests. Given this category or this milestone represents really a lower request volume phase where you'll need really more limited resource allocation to support. Planning then becomes a little bit more complicated and a little bit more resource intensive if you decide, for example, to leverage expanded access regulatory pathways to support specifically post-trial access, which is the second classification shown here on your screen. And then later in development, perhaps when the risk benefit profile for your product has been established and there's a path to commercialization, your organization might actually want to develop a more structured, a more broad expanded access program to treat maybe a specific cohort of patients and potentially across multiple countries. In this phase, the demand for expanded access obviously might increase because perhaps there's more awareness about your treatment. Your local country teams might be engaged with local key opinion leaders and other treating physicians. Patient advocacy engagements may be stronger at this point, and so on and so forth. Then after your first approval and your first commercial product becomes available, likely you're going to see that requests drop off as patients slowly transition to a commercial product. But at that same time, an expansion of the global footprint might actually be relevant as your launch plans mature and as importation pathways, the fourth category shown here, the importation pathways for a commercial product can be leveraged, potentially even using reimbursement mechanisms, enabling you to really effectively accelerate market access in countries that typically may be much later to launch commercially. So the point here is not that you need to adopt this specific classification. This is just an idea. This is an example. Rather, the point is to highlight that your company might benefit from distinguishing between these various milestones and establishing how planning, decision-making, and operations might actually evolve along the path. So once you have your terminology and your structure in place, a feat in and of itself, you'll then need some people to support within that framework. And specifically, you'll need people to support, obviously, with strategy and planning, but also implementation and management. And I'm also introducing here a group of subject matter experts. Identifying maybe specifically who is responsible and accountable for each bubble might vary by organization. It might be clinical operations, it might be clinical development, or maybe even medical affairs. There's really not one right answer. But what the key here is that responsibilities need to be assigned, and we need to ensure those assigned functions are empowered and held accountable to actually advance the initiatives forward. Um, I want to also comment a little bit specifically on subject matter expertise, which I've introduced here. I think often expanded access knowledge is rather diffuse within companies. It's not a company's main focus, and so that expertise is more diffuse. And sometimes the expertise can be limited. So oftentimes people don't have specific experience in this area. So consider, for example, within your organization, maybe establishing sort of a center of excellence intended to really centralize any expertise that you do have internally, and to have that group support as SMEs for project teams that have to go through the planning and implementation of expanded access, and make them responsible to connect with external experts to fill knowledge gaps when those gaps might exist. And this is all really to ensure that decision making about expanded access is really informed and without any misconceptions. So, Neve, now I want to turn to you regarding this kind of first puzzle piece. Can you comment on how, in your experience, has structured terminology played a role, or has it even presented a challenge in managing or planning expanded access?
Yeah, I mean, I think I think we've seen already that it's a challenge even between the way My Tomorrows talks about it and the way I do because of my current company. It's definitely an ongoing challenge for any of us working in this space. We have the terminology used by the guiding regulations in the country. As you mentioned, the FDA call it expanded access, the MHRA in the UK will call it special access, and so on and so forth. And then I think we have to consider the terminology that's used by the treating physicians and patients. I think probably most oftenly they call it compassionate use. But I do think probably with more companies coming with these, thought through programs, there's more of an awareness of the terminology of expanded access, early access, or managed access amongst physicians, I would say. At my company, we've actually had an additional challenge. So Alexion used to be a standalone biotech. We were bought over by AstraZeneca quite some years ago now, and we had to try and kind of reconcile the terminology across companies. So not just the terminology, but actually the scope of the type of programs that we were running at Alexion versus AstraZeneca. I think you touched on this, Steph. It's important, whatever terminology that you choose to use for your company, that you clearly define what's within the scope for you, and that it's a company-wide understanding and acknowledgement of that. It'll probably take a lot of time. You'll have to keep saying it over and over again, but I think it's so important that you're all aligned to that scope. And likewise, for any requests coming to your company from physicians, you need to be able to identify whether that kind of request will fit within the scope of the type of programs that you are running at your company.
Yeah, no, that all really rings true. And then I wonder, in your view, and based on your experience, are there functions that you think are best suited as kind of key players in planning expanded access versus implementation of expanded access? And what do you think are some kind of critical perspectives that each of those functions kind of brings to the table?
Yeah, definitely. So I think from a planning perspective, you really brought to the forefront the key players in your slide that we have reflected in the way that we work within Alexion. So the strategy development at our company is done by the global program team, and it's the global medical affairs function that kind of takes the lead in orchestrating that. However, it's really a very cross-functional process when we're developing those strategies. We obviously rely heavily on clinical development and safety when it comes to, assessing the benefit risk assessment in any decision to provide access to a medicine prior to approval. Regulatory for both ensuring we have a clear filing strategy for a particular product, and also obviously for information on early access regulations within the countries. Supply chain is clearly going to be core. We can't do any program unless we're assured we have sufficient supply available. And then I think market access is really becoming a very key player for us. We really need to ensure that there is a route to sustainable access for patients after the program has closed. At Alexion, we actually do have, as you mentioned, that kind of core center of excellence team. And we have created kind of a planning framework for the teams to be able to develop their strategy alongside with toolkits to support them. And then we obviously bring the subject matter expertise to help the programs build out those strategies. I think when it comes to implementation, obviously here the operations or delivery team are really going to take the wheel. And I think that's going to depend what your model is for expanded access. You know, I think there's models where we see companies where there's a fully in-sourced model, everything occurs within the company, a fully outsourced model where you're using a third party, or somewhere between the two. I think, as you mentioned, Steph, like regardless of whatever model you're using for delivery, it's really important to identify who's going to be responsible and accountable for the components of operations upfront.
Yeah, no, that's great. I think so. It sounds like kind of a maybe unofficial center of excellence has been developed within your organization, and
Yeah.
has what is this specific role of that central group? What do they sort of bring to the table? How are they supporting project teams that might be facing plans for expanded access?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, we're definitely the sounding board, and then, the touch point for if there's questions around, regulations, we're the team that actually can take kind of stay abreast of all of those changes. So it's really worked well for us. Like I said, we've also developed, toolkits and frameworks that allow kind of a structured approach to that strategy planning, but we're there holding their hands the entire way through it, I would say. I think probably just worth mentioning as well, at a previous company I worked with, we had a global center of excellence who were absolutely amazing. But in addition to the global center, they actually developed a network of local champions as well. So within the medical teams at the company affiliates. And like, honestly, this was amazing. It works really, really well. Especially when the concept of expanded access was first being embedded in that company. Any trainings from the global teams could be further amplified and embedded with the local champions with the kind of affiliate teams, so they could further let the affiliate teams know this is what expanded access is, this is how it's working. Likewise, a great source of country intel when you get potential changes in the regulations, which seem to be happening more often than not at the moment.
Of course, everything's always changing. Thank you so
Absolutely.
much for that. Thank you so much for that, Neve. I think we'll move on to the next piece of the puzzle, which is driving early and strategic planning for expanded access. So why should we plan early? Why not just wait for that first request to come in? As Neve gave an example in her earlier career where that was the case. And I think this might be how I personally plan for vacations, which is last minute. But I really don't recommend that approach when it comes to expanded access. In the case of expanded access, my mantra is always plan early and plan often. I think that when we have a plan, even if that early decision is to not provide expanded access to your treatment, at least we can be clear and transparent with all stakeholders, including physicians, patients, their caregivers, patient advocacy groups. We can ensure that any required public disclosures have been made appropriately, for example, on clinicaltrials.gov. And if we are, in fact, providing expanded access to our treatment, by planning ahead, we can really be equipped with appropriate instructions and guidance when that first request does come in from a physician. Um, Through early planning, we can also ensure that we have the appropriate infrastructure available to process those requests in a timely fashion, even for that very first request. In this way, we can be equipped with instructions, answers to questions. We have a mechanism in place for request management and a process for internal approvals for each request. And we have supply that's waiting and ready to be dispatched. Also, when we plan early, we can ensure that our expanded access programs are really optimized. For example, we can carefully select the population we intend to treat by defining really thoughtful eligibility criteria. We can identify opportunities for real world data collection to potentially enhance regulatory submissions or even pricing and reimbursement negotiations. We can define the country scope thoughtfully and in anticipation of our exit strategies, which are in consideration of market access and commercial launch plans. Planning early also facilitates risk identification and mitigation planning. For example, a common one is related to supply demand and other resource allocations, avoiding any adverse impact that any of these risks might actually pose to your clinical trials or other development activities. So I think if I could only apply this same kind of planning mantra to my vacation planning, being well prepared and well thought out, I'm sure I would have had the opportunity to see much more of the world by now and have much more interesting pictures to share. Uh, so as I mentioned earlier, uh, the key really is to plan early and plan often. We've discussed that there are certainly key trigger events along the development path that can drive the demand for expanded access. And we think that planning really should be in concert with those milestones. So for example, before your earliest data, you'll want to establish if your organization is going to consider those sort of ad hoc requests or the single patient requests. Um, Although your risk benefit profile might not be fully established at that time, a decision to actually provide very early expanded access might depend on the specific nature of the disease and the unmet need. And then as your development progresses, you'll need to really reassess your decisions and your plan based on, for example, new data that becomes available, or perhaps it changes in the broader treatment landscape. Maybe new treatments have been approved and are now reimbursed in some regions. And so maybe in a region there is not an existing unmet need. So you might need to adjust sort of the scope of your program in consideration of some of these changes. And so it's not just about really the timing or the quantity of planning, it's also very much about the quality of planning. And we've used this term a little bit already today, but I like to use the term expanded access strategy because I think it implies correctly that expanded access really demands a well thought out plan in consideration of many aspects, often involving multiple steps and multiple stakeholders. It demands careful resource allocation and thoughtful risk identification. So here we offer some examples of components of such a strategy. So first, when you're considering patient eligibility, you want to drive your team to consider expanded access eligibility really in the context of the target product profile. Is there sort of a best case versus base case scenario that needs to be considered? Are there any potential reimbursement criteria that you should anticipate and potentially align with to facilitate a smoother transition to commercial access in the future? And then regarding your global footprint and expansion, you'll want to consider where and how you should provide expanded access around the globe in consideration of both the commercial launch strategy, but also as well as in consideration of the global unmet needs. So think about how can you design your program to sustainably address those needs that exist around the globe. Then you'll want to think about if there is a need or an opportunity to collect real world data in your expanded access programs. I think real world data is becoming more and more mainstream and important as part of the development process and as part of negotiations with with payers. So you'll want to identify, if there is a need to collect real world data. Are there any data gaps that need to be filled? Are there real world insights that might support those payer discussions down the road? Or even are there insights that you think might be helpful for future clinical development activities? Pardon me. Or even potential label expansions down the road. And then regarding supply demand forecasting, you'll want to consider really the full picture for future demand. Make sure that you're accounting for everything. Post-trial access, investigator-initiated studies, commercial launch priorities, making sure that you're looking across the entire portfolio to really de-risk the allocation of supply for the purposes of expanded access. Pardon me, I'm going to take a sip of water. And then you'll want to also leverage opportunities to consider sustainable expanded access approaches, even beyond potentially your commercial launch footprint, just as I mentioned earlier, where funding models might actually exist to support that kind of sustainable approach around the globe. And then with regards to exit and transition plans, really just understand the approach, understand the timelines, make sure that you're aligned with your commercial launch teams and your medical teams, who will actually have the closest interactions with your future prescribing physicians. And I think you're probably wondering to yourself, how possibly can you facilitate this kind of complicated strategy development? And Neve mentioned this earlier, and I'm going to recommend it to you again now, is that, think about building a fit for purpose tool, which really covers all of the aspects of this strategy to ensure that each topic or each element is addressed, is documented, importantly, and is really aligned across all of the stakeholders. So now back to you, Neve, and I think this is important because my voice might need a bit of a break. I wonder, in your experience, what is the right time to start planning? How early is too early, or
Yeah.
is that even a thing? And what challenges have you maybe faced when taking like a very early approach to planning, and how have you been able to mitigate for those?
Yeah. So yeah, I think it's never too early is what I would say to start thinking about, your access strategy as a whole. But I think it's really important for you, your organization, to recognize that it's always going to potentially be subject to change, and that you need to kind of keep reassessing at each kind of individual point. It could be aligned to your clinical development program in terms of phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, or maybe commercial investment decisions, but keep having those check-ins to see, is your access strategy still up to date? Clinical programs will change. They don't always succeed. As you said, Steph, the treatment landscape can always change and new options can become available for patients, which erodes kind of any potential unmet need for an indication. But you need to remain, I think, agile to update your approach aligned to that changing environment. I think, as you mentioned, Steph, for us, we really have to tease apart our access strategy depending on the different types of access that you mentioned. So in rare diseases in particular, when there's no other treatment options available, we get a lot of those single patient requests very early in our development process. So that's why we have kind of a very early touch point. I was sitting with a GPT today discussing an access strategy for a product that's not going to potentially launch for another 6 years, but we have to define what our approach is at this point in time. Should we start receiving those requests, so that we can actually apply that approach equitably as we get those requests in. I think planning for expanded access programs, so the bigger programs, more often than not, these are kind of after your pivotal study has read out. Our biggest challenge there has really been establishing what that scope might be because of that changing environment. So you have to really work closely, I think, with the country markets to understand what that scope might look like. And again, recognizing that it can be subject to change and that you have to remain kind of flexible and be able to pivot to that change, I think, whether it's being driven by internal factors such as budgets, resourcing, etc., or potentially external factors such as change in treatment environment.
Yeah, no, I think completely agree with you that these plans are not stagnant. They evolve over time, and I think that brings us into the next topic around kind of the importance of being able to be agile, and important to have those touch points across the development path, with the appropriate governance structure in place to address the changing landscape. So we'll move on now to the third piece of the puzzle, which is just that cross-functional collaboration and governance. I think that we've established now that expanded access is really a complex undertaking. It requires a very coordinated effort, and driving cross-functional collaboration is going to help ensure that all aspects of expanded access are really carefully considered and managed, resulting in really an optimal expanded access approach, and efficient programs. And here we've just listed kind of a laundry list of functions that add specific value in strategic access or strategic expanded access planning. Um, and these functions might not all necessarily align within your organizational structure, but our intention is really to just provide some insights into what viewpoints are important. And specifically here, I want to call out the important role of a lead. And perhaps you can think of this person as the person who will be in charge of herding the sheep. Again, this lead doesn't need to come from any specific function, but we think it's critical to have a role like this that really drives the collaboration, ensures that the insights are being gathered in a centralized and a cohesive way. And then identifying how to best have this cross-functional team collaborate is really also relevant. And again, you'll have to determine what works best for your organization. It could be leveraging potentially an existing forum, or even potentially setting up a specific expanded access forum to have those discussions. But whatever the forum your organization decides on using, the key is really to drive focused discussions across all stakeholders that result in very specific deliverables. Ensure those discussions that you're having are covering all aspects of the strategy that I mentioned earlier, to really paint a full and clear picture and identify all of the potential risks to make sure that your programs are de-risked as much as possible. And remember that in the end, what you want to end up with is a strategy that holds up across executive leadership, who will inevitably try to poke holes and pressure test your assumptions and your approach that you define in your strategy proposal. So, Neve, what I presented very quickly and very briefly and very high level in this section was really focused more on a global level. But I wonder, and you mentioned a little bit earlier about the interaction with local teams. I wonder, um, what do you think is the interplay between the global team and local affiliates that you might have within your organization in the planning process?
Yeah,
And
I mean,
what do you think are sort of the key touch points with those teams?
yeah, I mean, it's such an important there's such an important group of people to be in touch with at all timeline all points, I think, along the planning process. I think, as I mentioned, really important when you're planning the scope of the global program. You know, they will have a lot of information that will let you understand potentially, how many patients might be included for that particular indication and over what period of time. What I found is, so a lot of that information will end up flowing through our medical affairs associates, it's really important to validate with them that they've actually cross-validated that with their cross-functional teams locally. What we've seen in the past sometimes is medical affairs coming with a very rosy kind of picture of, yes, absolutely, we want to have this program, but it actually hasn't been validated with, potentially their market access colleagues, where an access program may have the potential to impact on, a reimbursement approach in a particular country. So whoever you're getting your source of information from in the country, make sure that they are representing the full cross-functional team at the affiliate level, I would say. And I definitely think once the program's up and running, it's really important for the country teams to keep in touch with the operations team really on an ongoing basis. So the more touch points you can have, the better, whether that be in a kind of, monthly meeting or them coming to you proactively with the information. That's going to be super important for ensuring, if there's any changes to forecasting, making sure that there's a transition plan to commercial treatment once the program is ending and approval has been obtained. And also, field medical colleagues are really important for bringing insights about the program back to the global team. If there's any feedback about the program, about the inclusion/exclusion criteria, potentially about the platform, I think that's a really important source of information for continual improvement. I think one point worth mentioning, Steph, that I think is really key is to ensure that there's coordination on communications with the local team. So anytime, if you have a global early access operations team that's kind of running the program, if there's communications going out to treating physicians, to ensure that that's coordinated with the local team, so that, we're kind of speaking with one voice and they're not getting different informations from different parties.
No, that's very helpful. And I wonder, it sounds like you find value in kind of early engagements with the
100%.
local teams as you're planning expanded access programs. How do you kind of work through kind of disagreements or differences in approach that the global team is taking versus what the local team might want to, or how they might want to approach the problem?
In terms, do you think, meaning kind of in terms of scope of programs, like, what the
Yeah,
differences might be? Yeah, yeah.
yeah,
So definitely we've seen that before. And again, I think the more when you're trying to define a scope for a program and trying to identify how many potential patients might be included, the more data points you have, the better. So the approach that we kind of take is to try and collate information from as many different places as possible. So we'll look to publish literature for epidemiology numbers. We'll go to the commercial teams to assess, what they think the peak sales might look like and take a percentage of that. And then obviously the medical teams will have insights through discussions with their physicians on, where they really consider there to be a high unmet need for a particular indication. So I think that's how we kind of make sure that we have a 360 view, is taking information from as many places as possible. I think where there's disagreement, that's where this, center of excellence can come in to help and mitigate some of those differences. That team will have a lot of experience from previous programs that have been running, that they can kind of bring a little bit more context, whereas sometimes you have country teams where this is all very new for them and they think, the scope is going to be huge, and you can kind of the center of excellence can bring them back down to a bit of reality there, I think.
sure. Sounds good. So moving on then, I think defining also a clear path for governance and decision making is also helpful to sort of streamline activities, especially when you're able to leverage an existing structure that you might have for governance decisions for key development milestones. You'll need to define the appropriate timing and touch points for those decisions and governance review, and think about how expanded access planning might actually coincide with standard development governance touch points. As I said earlier, define who might be responsible to take that expanded access strategy through the approval process, who's responsible to bring that to governance for their review, and who really supports the engagements with those governance committees. You'll want to ensure that the governance pathways identified really enable the opportunity to address changes to the expanded access strategy as the plans kind of change over time, as you derive more data, as commercial launch strategies develop, et cetera. And I think Neve touched on this in some of her earlier comments. So, think about how do you bring your strategy proposals kind of to the next stage through a streamlined governance approval pathways. And now finally moving on to the last piece of the puzzle, infrastructure and resources. I think the most carefully thought out plan, the most strategic expanded access plan is not going to be impactful if you're not able to execute efficiently and effectively. And that's not possible without infrastructure really to support scalability. And this certainly is not an exhaustive list that I'm showing on this slide, but these are just some key aspects that I'll be touching on in this section where we too often see kind of shortcomings or challenges. And these are standard controlled procedures, request capture management, and supply chain. And honestly, I think we can probably have a webinar for each one of these topics individually. So we'll keep it quite brief, but just to give you kind of a little taster of what we think about in terms of best practices in these areas. So pragmatic execution, which is what I think we all want in our expanded access programs, is really in part relies on pragmatic processes. So if we are relying on clinical trial SOPs and processes for expanded access, it does not lend pragmatism to expanded access. Rather, it adds complexity that really drives ultimately inefficiency for your organization. Furthermore, clinical trial SOPs often don't address very specific aspects, which might be relevant only to expanded access. So my recommendation is really to think about developing a specific SOP for expanded access, or maybe even perhaps a small collection of SOPs, which address the specific components which are relevant to expanded access. Some of them, which are shown here on this slide, for example, the medical triage process required following request receipt prior to an official approval. What are the safety reporting processes in the context of expanded access? How do you manage real world data processes in expanded access? And even something as simple as documentation management should be covered. But again, the point is to keep it simple. Don't overcomplicate. Allow for agility and flexibility in whatever standard procedures you're establishing. And then next, request management that is systematic and centralized is really supportive of effective oversight. So it facilitates transparency by providing a single streamlined process for physicians, which ensures that all stakeholders, both internal and external stakeholders, understand the process. One mechanism or one approach also helps to simplify messaging and training initiatives. Systematic request capture also supports data-driven insights and reporting. It helps to reveal trends in requests. For example, you can see where demand might be very high in a specific country. It can support data-driven decision-making, and it makes aggregate reporting, especially if you have to report up to your executive teams, it makes that much more straightforward if you have everything centrally maintained and systematically collected. Finally, systematically capturing requests for expanded access, you can also ensure the appropriate structure is in place for internal medical triage and eligibility checks of patients to ensure that patients eligible for your clinical trials are directed appropriately to those clinical trials as a first option. As we said earlier in this presentation, you don't want to really have any negative impact on your normal development activities or your clinical trials that might still be recruiting for enrollment. And then centralization of request capture management using a compliant process really helps to avoid potential pitfalls that we've seen far too often. I think through the aggregation of request data, you're more easily able to track and predict the demand for expanded access, and then be more agile to adjust allocations of your supply appropriately. You can also ensure through a structured approach that it's consistent, that it's ethical, and it's compliant. and it maintains patient privacy through the entire process. And finally, you gain the opportunity to really track trends, which might elucidate the true global unmet need, which may offer additional development insights or opportunities for your organization. So back to you, Neve. Regarding request capture management, what elements do you think are most critical from your perspective? And what role specifically does technology play in the management of expanded access in your view?
Yeah, so I think, from a request management perspective, it's really important to have a formal triaging process, as you said, Steph, for, these global programs, to make sure you've identified upfront medical reviewers and backup reviewers. And, this is always going to be a job on top of somebody else's day to day. So you need to make sure you're aligned on your expectations of turnaround times when it comes to making a decision for these kind of requests. For formal programs, when you have the inclusion exclusion criteria, I think it's really important to make sure that whatever your request management system is that you're using, be it a digital one or a paper one, that you're requesting sufficient information that you can easily identify whether the patient can be included in the program. I think you want to mitigate the having to go back and forth between you and the treating physician to get more information. I mean, obviously, though, that's going to be the case when it's more in the ad hoc single patient request. You may need to have that option for engaging further with the requester. But as much as you can limit the timeline to making a decision, that's going to be best for everybody, including the treating physician and the patient. I think a digital request management platform is really key when you're running large scale programs. So a centralized platform, as you said, there's definitely a lot of great options out there. In the first instance, I think you're going to want a platform that's going to provide a good experience for the applicant. So something that's easy to sign up to, easy to use. If you have a platform that can easily visualize and provide an update on the status of any given request for a treating physician, I think that's ideal. Like if you think about, when you shop on Amazon, you can always just pop into the app and see like how many stops away your order is. That's the kind of, customer opportunity you want to show for your treating physicians, that they can see straight away where their request is at. I would say, I think anybody who's worked in this space, like I have worked with multiple platforms, and the one common thread is it doesn't matter how perfect you think your platform is, somebody will always complain about it. So just be aware of that. Sometimes it's legitimate, but sometimes it's just you have busy treating physicians, and even the act of having to sign up can be burdensome. From a company perspective, I think it's, as you said, Steph, having a platform that allows you to easily pull data for reporting purposes is really important. I have worked with platforms which were centralized in the past, but I couldn't pull an aggregate report. I would have to go into each individual request and extract the data manually. And really, that's not where you want to be spending your time. So, they're kind of my top tips, I would say, for request management platforms.
Yeah, so it sounds like the approach is really try to keep it simple for physicians, but on the back end, make sure that what you're gathering and how you're gathering it is really useful for your organization
Exactly.
in the end. So thanks for those insights. We're quickly coming up on the top of the hour, so I'm going to move on to talk a little bit about supply chain. Again, here you're going to want to make sure that your approach can be flexible and is really pragmatic. So first off, ensure that there's an approach for effective forecasting and supply allocation. So making informed decisions about potential demand, looking at the precedence of disease within countries in scope, but also it might take into consideration different practice patterns. For example, are patients being seen in centers of excellence where awareness of expanded access programs might be concentrated amongst a small group of physicians treating a large number of patients, really resulting in a potentially higher demand? Or are patients treated in community hospitals where they're more diffuse, and therefore awareness might also be more diffuse? Is there a strong patient advocacy group that might also drive awareness for the program? So thinking about all of these factors might actually impact your demand forecast. And also we've talked about agility and being adaptive. The forecasting for expanded access should also be adaptive based on the actual demand that you see within a program. And then regarding Labeling, you want your labeling to be pragmatic, you want a fit for purpose, a QP release established. So for example, we know in the majority of cases, an English pack can be acceptable, or you can request a waiver to use an English pack. So really simplifying the approach can help to ensure that you're able to fulfill requests in a timely fashion, and you're not rate limited by complicated supply packaging processes. And so leveraging sometimes expert expanded access labeling advice can be helpful to make sure that you're not overcomplicating your supply labeling process. And then finally, establishing sort of appropriate distribution pathways according to your program's global footprint can also really help minimize shipping timelines and costs, including importation tax implications, as an example. Um, Again, I think leveraging established distribution networks, whether those are internal or external, can really simplify your global approach. Supply chain absolutely can be a sticky one to manage in expanded access, but when you do plan it appropriately and pragmatically, things can really work to your advantage. I'm going to just very quickly highlight, not go into any detail on this slide around change management, but I just want to highlight that if in fact you are thinking of building an internal framework, establishing any or all of the aspects that we've discussed today, a big component that really should not be overlooked is effective change management. And here we present just a few concepts to help you drive forward any change within your organization. And so maybe we'll stop quickly with a thought from Neve regarding change management when it comes to expanded access. You mentioned things are always evolving, something's always changing. I wonder, can you comment quickly on how you and your organization really approaches continuous change management to be kind of adaptive and
Mhm.
agile?
Yeah. I think ultimately just having a flexible operating framework that you can quickly adjust to accommodate changes is really key. You're going to learn something from every single program that you undertake. So, in advance, think about what your key performance measures are going to be, how are you going to track them, remembering obviously to leverage your digital platform for this. And then really once a program is closed, take the time, do a lessons learned after each program and bring those forward to kind of optimize your process further. I think with all change management, you have to be ready to bring the organization along with you. So while you and your teams may be experts in expanded access, don't underestimate the potential kind of lack of awareness or understanding of the space in the broader organization. I'd say there's no such thing as too much education in this space. So you might feel like you're repeating yourself again and again and again, but really, it is quite a niche area and the concepts do take some time to take hold. So, continue with your continuous education within your organization, I would say.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. It's a heavy lift for sure, but I
It
think
is,
change
yeah.
management is a really important aspect. Um, and so just finally, some key takeaways from today. I hope you've all found this discussion useful. Again, key takeaways. Really think about aligning across the organization and how that can be impactful, both in the way you discuss about expanded access, how you plan for expanded access, and make decisions about the area can really be impactful for patients and your organization as a whole. Require early and strategic planning and enforce that through structure and governance. It really supports optimization of your expanded access offerings. Identify key stakeholders and decision makers that can streamline from planning to implementation. And finally, establish internal infrastructure that's fit for purpose to reduce complexity and really maximize seamless scalability. Um, Unfortunately, we don't have any time left to open up the Q&A section, but I saw a lot of great questions come through the webinar chat, so we will certainly send responses following this webinar. I want to again thank you everyone for joining the discussion today and for those thoughtful questions. We will be sending out the recording via an email in just a few days. If you have questions or if you want to explore how My Tomorrow supports companies with expanded access, you can contact me using the email address that you see up on your screen. And also for those of you who might be there, I'll be attending the ASCO conference in Chicago in just a few weeks. So if you or one of your team members is also attending and wants to connect in person to chat more about these concepts or anything about expanded access, please feel free to reach out and we can set up a quick meeting. Thank you again, and I hope everyone enjoys the rest of your day. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye, everyone.
Bye, Neve. And thank you so much, Neve.
Of course, no worries.
Final thought. Thank you so much. Very insightful. Have a great day.
Take care. Bye.